50, blah, 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 30 years of blah, 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 and where has that led us?
What has COP26 achieved? Has anyone here been meaning it, or has it all just been blah, blah, blah? Well, let's start at the easy end and work up to the hard stuff. Point 1. There's a new US-China agreement. The US and China, guided by their veteran climate envoys John Kerry and Xi Jinping, I hope I've said that right, have made an agreement to work together this decade to limit global temperature to 1.5. That's a good step, since they're the two countries emitting the most carbon at present. And it might put a dent in the anti-China racist rhetoric that's been growing in these times, fanned by right-wing politicians and media. Scapegoating China provides an excuse for disavowal and inaction elsewhere. It's not worth any of us bothering to do anything, is there, if China isn't bothering? So we may as well go flying or whatever we want to do. Some UK media, in fact, tried to make out that China was turning its back on the COP just because the president of China didn't make an appearance here. They didn't highlight the fact that China's most experienced climate negotiator was here, a rather more relevant person at climate talks. Let's face it, even the UK's PM, Boris Johnson, has barely been around, despite the UK being the COP's host this year. I said the US and China are the biggest emitters in the world. Well, they are currently, but if you include historic emissions, China slides rapidly down the list, and the UK slides up because, as we all know, the UK started the Industrial Revolution, which started putting massive quantities of carbon into the atmosphere. And a lot of the carbon currently up there, still causing trouble, is carbon that the UK has been putting up there for over 200 years. But there's also another, less well-known reason why the UK really needs to be up there at the top of the league of carbon addicts. And here's Donald McCarthy to explain why.
The most important thing to remember about the United Kingdom is that we're like a we're like a publican. He's actually halved his own alcohol consumption. But the United Kingdom is a seller of alcohol. What do I mean by that? 15% of global investments in new fossil fuels come from the City of London. Two oil companies are investing hundreds of billions of pounds. Two British oil companies, Shell and BP, are investing so much money, it's twice the carbon emissions of the United Kingdom. And then we're over 50% of the global insurance market for fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas. And finally, we're a major centre for the PR agency that actually put huge amounts of effort through the media to get social permission and greenwashing for the banks, the fossil fuel banks, and for the fossil fuel corporations. So if you look at the United Kingdom as a whole, per person, we're probably 15 times more responsible than almost any country in the world, because we are a massive centre of the global fossil fuel industry that people never talk about. So when people talk about China, China is responsible for direct emissions mainly because it's become the manufacturing centre for the world. So they export a lot of their emissions. But the United Kingdom is a centre of the investment industry, insurance industry, and PR industry that actually runs and motors the fossil fuel industry across the planet. And so that's why we have a massive carbon footprint that's never attributed to us.
Point 2, deforestation. The second positive outcome from the COP is that more than 100 countries have now promised to end deforestation by 2030 or even to reverse it. Importantly, this includes Brazil, home to the Amazon rainforest. And as many of you will have read, the Amazon had reached a terrifying tipping point where the trees were no longer absorbing carbon, but were beginning to emit it. The third point is methane. The US and the EU have now announced a global partnership to cut methane emissions by 2030 by 30%. And that would be one of the best ways to reduce global warming fast, because methane is about 28 times more powerful than carbon dioxide at warming the Earth on a 100-year timescale, and more than 80 times more powerful over 20 years. So if you can reduce the methane we emit, it can buy us time to work on the rest of the greenhouse gases. Point 4, ratcheting up the NDCs. A group of the 20 most climate vulnerable countries formed the Climate Vulnerable Forum, or CVF, in 2015, and this group has been growing rapidly. Last week at the COP, the CVF swelled to 55 countries, and they signed a climate emergency pact. And one of its key demands was that the NDCs are ratcheted up every year. I'll let Mark explain more.
So the CVF has got a whole manifesto going up into the COP. Central to that is the idea of a climate emergency pact. So, I mean, there's different components to that, but basically it's an end to business as usual. This isn't like, we can't just keep coming back year after year, COP after COP, like COP, what's it going to be, COP26 or something? And, you know, we're still talking about carbon markets and all of the modalities of Article 6 and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, we need a step change where it's recognized as being an emergency and a crisis, which needs to be addressed in that kind of fashion. So not just once a year, but in an ongoing sense. And part of what, you know, like, so out of Paris, the NDCs only have to be updated every 5 years. And if you're trying to meet 1.5 and, you know, it's the 2030 emissions goal, which makes the difference to that, there's no point in just doing that every 5 years, because it's, you know, somebody won't be reporting until 2028, and, you know, it's way too late. So one of the central asks for the CVF is to have annual pledges, so that you can up the ambition and kind of, you know, have a kind of ratcheting effect of increasing ambition every single year rather than every 5 years, which is just too slow.
Point 5, and this is really the hard stuff, money. Back in 2009 at the Copenhagen COP, the rich countries promised that they would provide $100 billion a year to poor countries to help them become climate resilient. This may sound a lot of money and very generous, but it isn't. In the first place, it's just enlightened self-interest, as Simon will explain.
We need to be building bridges, and that can work because there is a common interest. It isn't in Europe's interest to have heating of 2.5 or 3 degrees, just as it isn't in the interests of the Maldives or the Marshall Islands. So that gives us a shared interest, a common platform on which to build an agreement, and then of course come all the discussions about how to deliver it and what it's going to cost.
And here are 2 more reasons why $100 billion is, how can I put it, unimpressive. First, $100 billion for the whole of the global south is chicken feed. It's just $1 or $2 billion per country. When you think that the UK spent over $50 billion just on its track and trace system during the COVID epidemic, it puts it into perspective. Mark Carney, who's now the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance and the financial advisor to the COP presidency, has admitted we need trillions, not millions, hundreds of trillions. And the second point is that this money, this $100 billion, wasn't promised till 2020. That's 11 years after the Copenhagen COP. And yet now, 2020 has come and gone without the money. And in 2021 even, the money still isn't forthcoming. The promise is that it will start to come in 2023. There's also been a little movement on funding for adaptation, preparing for climate impacts like floods and droughts, with perhaps $40 billion a year coming. Not enough to buy a track and trace system from the UK, but something. Then there's the question of payments for the loss and damage already inflicted on the global south. Since virtually all the climate damage has been inflicted by the industrializing processes of the rich North, these countries shouldn't be seen as donors to the South, but as polluters who've messed up the South. And surely the polluter should pay to clear up its mess.
Don't call them donor countries, they're polluters. All right? They're not donors, they're polluters. They owe this money.
The South believes with cause that they have a moral right to money from the North. But rich countries have shrunk back, fearing exposure to unlimited financial liabilities. But the Glasgow text changes the wording that addresses loss and damage, slightly anyway. Some protesters are going further and calling for reparations to underline the fact that the North is responsible for the damage in the South. But others fear that calling for reparations may be a bad tactic, that it'll only turn the issue into a legal battle that'll delay the handover of the money for even longer. And that means that poor countries may have to go on suffering the indignity and the injustice of being painted as the lucky recipients of Northern beneficence. Point 6, and this is really the ultimate crunch. Coal, that old villain that really ought to be booed off stage by now. More than 40 countries have now committed to move away from coal at this COP, which is a start. But it still leaves an awful lot of countries still not signed up, including the world's biggest coal users, like China and the US. We know why the US hasn't signed. President Biden has been stymied by all those US politicians who are still in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry. Fossil fuels have made them rich, and they apparently can't see beyond their wallets to the destruction of the planet's ecosystem. It's also manifestly unfair to expect a developing country like China, struggling with immense poverty, to make a move out of coal in the same time frame as a rich one. Well, imagine a street with a rich family in a well-insulated house at one end of the street and a poor family in a ramshackle, leaky house at the other end. And now imagine them trying to buy an air source heat pump, which costs many thousands of dollars. The rich family would be able to buy it at once, but the poor family would really struggle to afford that, and they'd have to find the money to insulate their house first. It's just not a level playing field.
Look, I think this is a really interesting and difficult issue. If you're a country which has big development needs, as some of those do, not Canada so much, obviously, but China and India and many countries in Africa, and you need energy in order to develop, and as it happens, you have access to coal or oil or gas, then you need to think really hard about the steps you're going to take in order to develop without using those resources. We've seen in Europe how important it is when you think about the transition out of coal to think about the social costs as well as simply the energy transition. Germany, you know, has something like 45 billion euros in a fund which is designed to compensate the coal mining communities and the coal mining regions, helping people to find new jobs, new skills, new industries that will replace the coal. And we know in the UK how difficult it is if the coal mining industry stops to replace the jobs and the livelihoods for people. And we had a long-standing, deep scarring caused by the closure of the coal mines when Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister. So I feel great sympathy for countries like India and China who are trying to make this transition. Now, the UNFCCC, interestingly enough, has a device which is highly relevant to this, which is that they ask for two kinds of commitments for countries: the unconditional nationally determined contributions and the conditional nationally determined contributions. And the point of having this second tier, these conditional NDCs, is for countries to be able to say, well, we can do this, but this is the kind of help we need. Now, I haven't studied every single nationally conditional NDC, but my sense is they're not very complete, and they're not necessarily as demanding of rich countries as they should be. And I'd like to see really good transition plans which include both the technical and the social costs, and that developed countries are then able to provide more support to those who are making the transition.
Added to this section now are the words recognizing the need for support towards a just transition, highlighting the need for funds to retrain fossil fuel industry workers, which is a very good thing. But the thing that really strikes me more than anything else in this agreement is that fossil fuels have never been mentioned in the official text at all since Kyoto. It's the most extraordinary thing that fossil fuels, which are the root cause of the climate crisis, haven't been mentioned for decades. Such is the power of the fossil fuel lobby, to be able to create this long conspiracy of silence. Even though the world has been subsidizing fossil fuels, according to the IMF, at the rate of $11 million per minute. But now, at last, at Glasgow, the taboo has been broken. It's the first crack in the dike, the explicit global acknowledgement that subservience to the fossil fuel lobby has been the problem. And it shows up the immense power of the fossil fuel industry and the billionaires who have significant shares in it, the same billionaires who also own large parts of the mainstream media. But this time, they haven't been able to force the COP to take the references to fossil fuels out. In the same taboo-breaking vein, COP26 saw a new alliance being formed, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, or BOGA for short. The BOGA Alliance was initiated by Costa Rica and Denmark and launched last Thursday, the 11th of November, and it commits countries not only to setting a date to ending oil and gas use, but to stop granting any new licenses for exploration. BOGA is still a very small alliance, just a dozen or so countries, and it needs to grow if it's to make enough difference, but it is another significant crack in the dike.
Because I think we all agree that a transition needs to be a just transition. So there's a need for a place where you can have the conversations about how to actually then make that. In my own country, Denmark, we've made this decision, but it hasn't been an easy one. It's been an expensive one, and it's been a decision that influences a lot of people. So for us, it's important to invest in the parts of our country that is affected by this. This means schooling, training of the people employed in the sector to get other jobs. It means investing in alternatives like renewable energy. In Denmark, for instance, offshore wind now has more than 30,000. We have more than 30,000 people working in the wind industry. And with regards to offshore wind, every time we establish new offshore wind of 1 gigawatt capacity, we estimate that that creates almost 15,000 jobs.
So, given these significant but still small steps, will carbon emissions be cut 45% from 2010 levels by 2030? Because that's what must happen if we're to stop global heating at 1.5 degrees. Here's a statement that caught people's imagination by the EU's climate lead, Frans Timmermans.
This morning, or an hour ago, my son Mark sent me a picture of my grandson, Kees, who's 1 year old. I was thinking, Kees will be 31 when we're in 2050. And it's quite a thought to understand that if we succeed, he'll be living in a world that's livable. He'll be living in an economy that is clean, with air that is clean, at peace with his environment. If we fail, and I mean fail now in the next couple of years, he will fight with other human beings for water and food. That's the stark reality we face. So 1.5 degrees is about avoiding a future for our children and grandchildren that is unlivable. I might not reach 2050, probably won't, but he will be there as a young man And I want him to live peaceful, prosperous life, like I want it for everybody's children and grandchildren in this room. This is personal. This is not about politics. And I don't live in Palau. I don't live on Barbados. I don't live on the Marshall Islands. But there it's even far more personal because you're standing with your feet in the water. And this is what we need to address today. We need to make sure major emitters reduce their emissions so that we keep 1.5 alive. That needs to be at the heart of our conclusions today.
But that's the prospect for his grandson in the distant future, decades away. For the Global South, this kind of horrifying prospect is already a reality, and for millions of people. A representative from Kenya said that 2 million Kenyans are facing starvation now due to crop failures caused by drought. He said, "We bleed when it rains, we cry when it doesn't rain." 1.5 is not a statistic, it's a matter of life or death. And that's what life is like now at 1.1 degrees of warming. What will life and death be like at 1.5 degrees even? Ideally, we'd return to 1.0 or back to zero, but 1.5 is all we can realistically aim for now. But for a COP to aim for 1.5 even has taken a significant mind shift. It was almost unimaginable back in Copenhagen in 2009. Whenever I asked a scientist or policymaker there about 1.5, they scoffed at my even posing such a question to them. By the Paris COP, though, in 2015, 1.5 could be held as an aspiration, a distant dream. But here in Glasgow, there's been a solidifying for 1.5 as a very real goal that the COP is aiming for. Of course, we're only talking about a psychological shift, not a reality. But what we imagine as humans to be possible is key to the realities we then create. Another world is possible, people were saying at Porto Alegre in Brazil back in 2003 at the World Social Forum, and even further back in 1968 during the Student and Workers' Revolution in Paris. The Situationists were saying, demand the impossible. In other words, we shouldn't stay in the prison we've constructed. We have to step outside the prison door and imagine in order to create the world we want. And we'll only take the low-carbon pathway if the rich countries face up to their responsibilities and act fast. John Kerry, the US envoy, admits that 20 countries equal 80% of the emissions. That's the G20. And he says, they do bear the greatest responsibility. I'm glad he admits it. I hope everybody does now. And he talked up this COP saying, there is a spirit of determination here to get this done and to get it done well. But how will the mainstream media report on the COP? Because a balanced assessment is crucial, since what the media persuades the public of will become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If the media scoffs too much, dismissing the COP as a total failure, that could seriously undermine public belief that there's any point in doing anything. They'll just go on with their casual flying and casual beef eating, and without realizing it, give comfort to the fossil fuel lobby, who then feel they can carry on with business as usual. Conversely, if the media overhypes the outcome of COP26, that could persuade the public that there never really was a problem, and again, carry on with business as usual. So the key question remains, are the agreements now in place meaningful enough to bring about a 1.5 world, assuming they're implemented along a low-carbon pathway? The answer could be yes, if the politicians, especially those in high polluting countries, honour their agreements, and if the negotiators can ratchet up improvements year on year at every succeeding COP, and if the rest of us encourage each other enough to reduce our carbon footprints. Not that what we do will make enough difference to save the planet, but because our engagement will maybe help us vote in politicians we recognize as meaning it, and help us see through politicians that really don't. And it'll help us to adapt voluntarily, step by step, to a necessarily different kind of lifestyle, one that is less dependent on high consumption and more aligned to fulfilling our deeper values. So, all in all, is COP26 a success or a failure? Well, the COP consists of a hard-nosed group of negotiators, many of them struggling with sincerity and determination to make progress in a realpolitik hard world. And there might be enough in the cover text now to avoid an irreversible climate cataclysm. The end of the world will probably no longer be nigh. It obviously hasn't moved the dial enough to satisfy those of us fighting for global justice. There isn't enough in these agreements to save the 2 million souls starving in Kenya at the moment, nor the tens of millions of others like them at grave risk in impoverished communities all around the world, nor the hundreds of thousands of species of plants or animals in danger of extinction. For that to be achieved, the COP would have to agree to release the trillions that Mark Carney referred to, the hundreds of trillions, in fact, fat chance, in a place where 0.4 billion or even $0.2 billion are hyped as wonderful acts of generosity. The world is still swung around by the iron fist of a tiny minority of super-rich oligarchs. And unless and until that fundamental global power structure is shattered and a new and empathic democracy, a genuine democracy, emerges, our world will never be